Tonight I'm joined by two great stalwarts of First World War history in Flanders. Roger Stewart, battlefield guide, historian and author, whose books on the aftermath of the Great War at Ypres and the German cemetery at Langemarck are First World War classics in my view. And also Dominiek Dendooven of the In Flanders Fields Museum, himself an author who's cast light into so many different aspects of the lesser known history of that conflict in Flanders Fields. And in this episode, we're going to discuss the Demarcation Stones that were placed on the battlefields after the Great War to act as beacons to the conflict and look at their past, present and future history and a special project relating to them as that comes into play. So, good evening, gentlemen. Welcome to the podcast and thanks for joining us.
Good evening, Paul.
So, I mean, first of all, I know you're both working with the Ypres League, which is a kind of reincarnation of a much older organisation. I don't know if you want to say something about that first.
Yeah, the new Ypres League came about really after a discussion between myself and Dominiek, and we were looking at the future really, of commemoration in the Ypres Salient, and as time goes on, of course, the personalities involved get older and older, and they become less and less. And we were a bit concerned really that maybe in 15, 20 years time that there wouldn't be many people doing this. So we thought it was a very apt idea, I suppose, to reform the original Ypres League, but in its new incarnation as the new Ypres League. Bearing in mind and taking into account a lot of its original aims and objectives, but also, of course, moving it forward, as we believe the original Ypres League would have done had it have continued, post World War II. So that's the main reason why, the new Ypres League came into existence. And it's really, in about a year and a half, it's gone from strength to strength. We have Lady Lucy French, the relative of Sir John French, as our president. The mayor of Ypres, Catherine de Summer, is our vice president. One of our patrons, James Stewart Smith, runs a company called Classic Battlefield Tours in the UK. He's been excellent for us, in terms of fundraising as well. Jeff Vashora, one of the old ski parents from the city, is a patron, and Paul Brainer as well, the ex-governor of Flanders. And also we've got now a membership of over 100. So in about 18 months, the organisation has progressed and evolved as well. So the people involved, the members, tend to be, people like ourselves, people who have a passion, for the Ypres Salient, what it represents, its monuments, its history, and of course, remembrance as well.
And what I would like to add is that it is, and that makes it extraordinary, it is a Anglo-Belgian organization. So it also fosters the historic bonds, and through these historic bonds between Ypres and, well, let's say the Commonwealth, we also foster friendship amongst Britons and Belgians. And I think Roger and I are a good example of that. He's a Brit living in exile in Ypres, and I'm a fully bred Belgian. So, and that's, I mean, if we think about the original idea of the Ypres League, that takes it somewhat beyond that, though the initial idea behind the original Ypres League was bringing together those for whom Ypres meant something more, of course, in the context of the First World War. And that also goes for us, but with a stronger Anglo-Belgian bonds and an accent on that as well.
Well, like, just to add to that as well, as Dominiek mentioned, the word Commonwealth and, and encompassing all different countries. One of our patrons is Mr. Gurpreet Singh, and Gurpreet is kind of, I suppose, one of the leaders here in the local Sikh community. And we've worked very closely, myself and Dominic in particular, with the Sikh community here. And between us and St George's Memorial Church in Ypres, we arranged for a plaque to be placed in honour of a Sikh fallen here during the Great War. So we're very keen on promoting relations. We're a very inclusive organisation.
Yeah, we also felt there was a need for it, because if you look at the existing groups active in Ypres, well, you've got obviously the British Legion, but that is a veterans-based organization and a purely British. You've got the Last Post Association, but of course the focus on the Last Post Association, bless them, is continuing the daily Last Post ceremony at the Menin Gate. You've got the Western Front Association, but they are more into, well, let's say, scholarship and research. So there was really, we felt there was a need for an extra organization who would do something different than the others. And so we have a focus on active commemoration, being present at reburials, rededications, making sure that groups that are less, as Roger just said, groups that are less commemorated so far are included, and taking care of, well, maybe sometimes forgotten memorials and forgotten aspects of the First World War, such as the Demarcation Stones.
And kind of going back to that original Ypres League, one of the things that they did was to kind of begin to put some of the infrastructure of remembrance and battlefield tourism into place in that post-war period, including being involved in the Demarcation Stones. Now, perhaps not everyone listening to this will know what a demarcation stone is, so I don't know if you want to kind of give a overview of their history and how they came about.
Yeah, it's a very interesting history, and they're very unusual memorials. There's a lot of them. There are tens of them. The idea comes from a French sculptor who proposed to have boundary stones all along. Like nowadays, we usually call them demarcation stones, but in a press release from the early 20s, they are quite, in a quite good way, described as boundary stones marking the high tide watermark of the invasion. And that's exactly what they do. The idea was, let's point out what was the furthest point ever reached by the invading German armies during the 4 years of conflict, which makes them a very, very strong, I mean, now that we're nearly 110 years after the First World War, the landscape has changed so much, whether it's in Belgium, certainly in Belgium, but also in many parts of France, that reading the landscape, if you're not very familiar with what happened, is very, very difficult. And hence these demarcation stones, which mark the furthest point reached by the German armies, are very helpful, because they show you exactly what, and if I say exactly, I mean, if you compare it with the aerial photographs and the trench maps, there might be 2 or 3 meters wrong, insofar that it's wrong, but I mean, that's really, they're clearly right on the spot where the Allied troops had the Germans stopped. So they're very important in explaining the reality of the military actions in the First World War.
It's a good point, because if you start reading the Ypres Times, which was the quarterly journal from the Ypres League, and also the CWGC have a file on the Ypres League and Demarcation Stones as well. During the pilgrimages, lots of veterans were returning and families were returning. And of course, in years after the First World War, the battlefields had been cleared. And all of a sudden, these places which they recognised during the war were no longer there. So the placement of demarcation stones was also felt important in that respect as well. So veterans could recognise, for example, where Hellfire Corner was and now is, or Pateza or whatever. So it was a good marker point for the veterans to know that also the war had been there. It hadn't all been cleared away and forgotten about. It was, actual point of remembrance as well.
And there were several different designs of these stones.
Yeah, that was also what I was going to stress, that it is an inter-allied commemorative project. Even if the initiative was taken by a Frenchman and by the French touring club, which is something like the AA, it was inter-allied. So you do have three different types along the Western Front. You've got French type, and well, the stones are about, they're not taller than 1 meter, so it's about 3 feet. The French type is topped with a French Adrian helmet and has a French type of drinking bottle and hand grenade on the sides. You've got the British sides, which has the Brodie, the tin helmet on top, and then a British type drinking bottle and hand grenades on the sides. And you've got the Belgian type with the Belgian Adrian helmet, and then again drinking bottle and hand grenade. So they each time, for instance, if you look into in Belgium along the Ypres front, most of them are Belgian, and then in Ypres you've got a mixture of French and British types. And it's not only inter-allied; it's also it also shows you the different moments where the Germans had to be stopped. So, for instance, on the Ypres front, they're nearly all mark the 1914 October, November 1914 point, furthest point reached by the Germans. While around Ypres, it's nearly all except in the Poezing area north of Ypres, where, for instance, the French and the Belgian Demarcation Stone are 1915, the Second Battle of Ypres, and particularly the gas attack of 22nd of April 1915. But east and south of Ypres, it's actually the German Spring Offensive, because that was the moment when the Germans got closest to Ypres. And it's very, I mean, still to me sometimes, it's still very surprising how close to Ypres they got. For those familiar with the area, I mean, Zillebeke Lake, Hellfire Corner is just, 15 minutes walk from the Menin Gate. So that's another important aspect about these demarcation stones. Not only that they're inter-allied, but also that they show you how even in April and May 1918, the Allied troops had to stand together to make that German push stop.
And in terms of numbers across the battlefields, I think they initially planned to put one every kilometre, didn't they? So there would be like, I don't know, 400, 500, 600 of them, but that wasn't ever achieved. But there's quite a large number in Flanders compared to some of the other individual battlefields.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are, I don't know in total in France and Belgium. In Belgium, 22 were planned, 22 probably have been erected as well, and 2 have disappeared, probably in the Second World War. There's one of whom we are a bit unsure because there are no existent photos. So there are still 20 all along between Newport and the Belgian coast and the French border south of. So that's actually a huge number. They're not all in a good shape though. Sometimes during the Second World War, what the German army did was, well, in English the text is, "Here the invader was brought to a standstill." However, in Dutch, in Flemish, the text reads, "Hier de verweldiger was stopped," and the verweldiger it's more aggressive. It's more it's less neutral than the invader. So what you see is that in quite some cases the stones remained, but the engraved letters were removed. You still have some who are completely original. One on the Azer front, that's a very particular and quite funny story, was covered at the beginning of the Second World War by a heap of manure by the neighboring farmer, and that's how it survived the Second World War intact. But most of them, especially in the Ypres Salient, and especially the British ones, the ones who were erected by the original Ypres League, are quite damaged, which is one of the reasons why we really want to put our hands on it and improve their outlook.
Those the nationalities involved in terms of the the helmets and the equipment on the demarcation stones themselves. Also kind of highlights, as Dominiek was saying, the international nature of the original Ypres League. Because of the 19 or 20 or so stones placed around the Ypres Salient area and in Belgium, the Ypres League paid for 7.5 actually, 7 full ones and half of one over at Kemmel. And they're not just British stones. Some are French, for example, the one at Pateza, for example. So the Ypres League actually paid for, as I say, 7 of these stones. And as Dominiek just kind of intimated, all of which now are in pretty poor condition in terms of weathering, for example. It's mainly, apart from, the Germans removing the text in the Second World War, it's mainly just, wear and tear and natural wearage, really. So that's the reason why the new Ypres League now are launching this project to get these demarcation stones brought back up to standard.
Yeah, when they were raised and erected in the 1920s, as Roger just said, they were paid for by organizations and individuals. And it's a problem we're still sometimes faced with. It is quite easy to erect a new memorial, but the problem is that you also have to arrange the maintenance. And of the demarcation stone, it's even those. I mean, they're all listed by the Flemish government, so they're all protected as heritage. But there's no one who's owning it, so there's no personal connection. There's no organization or individuals who have a personal connection with these and who maintains them, which is why we saw a role for the new Ypres League to take that on.
In my opinion, it was almost like our responsibility, as we reformed or restarted, the organisation based on the old organisation's values. And as Dominiek has just said, because of the different ownerships at the time, they've kind of slipped through the net in terms of upkeep and who owns them. It was almost, for me, our responsibility to take this on, and do this, because as a battlefield guide here in the Salient as well, and yourself, Paul, and Dominiek, with the work you do here, and all the other guides and everybody else who visits the area, as far as I'm concerned, we're all custodians, of the Ypres Salient. And we can't just let things go or ignore things and say, well, it's nothing to do with us or whatever. So, as I say, from an organisational point of view, this is almost a duty for us to get these stones renovated and back to a reasonable condition, so future generations can come and and enjoy them and learn about them and the history of the Salient.
Just to give you an idea of how possibly complicated the ownership and the custodianship is like the one at Hellfire Corner. Flemish Heritage Agency asked us, okay, fine if you want to work on the maintenance, but you have to have permission of the owner. But there is no owner. So I had to contact the Ypres town administration, city administration, and the only thing they did was looking at, oh yes, apparently it's public domain, so we own the ground. But I mean, this is a clear example of public ownership, and the public, that's you and me, that's all of us.
But I guess that when the Ypres League, like so many of these organisations, kind of thought about this, the idea of legacy was probably a long, long way from their minds, because the war was so recent and that generation was still coming to terms with it all. And they're featured quite heavily, aren't they, in the Ypres League magazine, the Ypres Times, and I think they're marked on the map of the Salient that the Ypres League produced. So they're kind of part and parcel of it. But I guess they never thought that one day there would be a question of ownership to ensure their long-term preservation.
And by and large, I mean, these are pink granite structures. They're still there. I mean, there is some wear and tear, but if you compare it to, well, let's say the Portland headstones, which is very soft stone, there the wear and tear is even much, much, much bigger. But of course, then you've got the War Graves Commission taking care of it. Here, the granite has withstood time quite well, taken into account. I mean, from the 22nd, who were probably erected in Belgium, 20 are still on the spot where they were over 100 years ago erected. So they're quite sturdy structures. It's just the fine tuning. For instance, the lettering that has disappeared, the details were not clear anymore.
Yeah, the one at Hellfire Corner is a particular example of that, because for a start you can't read the word Ypres, at the top, underneath the helmet. I don't quite know how, but it's somebody's drilled holes in the back of it, for example. There was a poem stuck to it with mastic at one point on the front, and that's glue, and that's damaged the front of that. So the whole thing needs, as Dominik's saying, the detail needs recutting. So you can read the word Ypres, you can see the hand grenades and the gas mask and a water bottle on the side, and text on the bottom as well. Recognizing the fact that who designed these things and who paid for them. Because the Ypres League ones have the Ypres League text on the bottom as well. So the whole project is aimed at not restoring them to 100% of their original condition, because it's important they still retain the fact that they're over 100 years old, but getting them to a condition now where maybe future generations won't have to look at restoring them again for maybe another 50, 100 years or whatever.
And the Hellfire Corner one has been moved around quite a lot. I think, is that the one that's been moved the most, maybe?
Yeah, but short distances. There were some others who have been moved much further. I'll just give you one example of about, I think, 10 or 15 years ago. And that was the one on Klein Vierstraat, which is a British type, if I remember well, or a French type. So anyway, 1918 German Spring Offensive. Clearly, if you look at the regimental diaries of that period, on the spot where indeed the first line was established during the German Spring Offensive there. But at one stage, the Heuveland, so the civil parish of Heuveland, Camel, decided, well, it will be much better if it's standing next to the American Memorial along the Camel Road. But that is a mile further up, and absolutely not historically not correct. So then, well, we advocated it being removed, which was done after a while. So it was put back on. I think that was the one that was moved furthest from its point of origin. Hellfire Corner, that has been moved, but mainly because of traffic reasons. First, when there was a railroad there, which is no longer there, and a tram line, and then finally the last time when the large roundabout was built. And I don't see how it could be done otherwise, because if it would have stood in the middle of a huge roundabout, it would just have disappeared because it's so small. So at least now it is approachable. And one of the things we also would like to do is at Hellfire Corner, not at any of the others, but at Hellfire Corner, having a panel in the neighborhood erected which explains about these demarcation stones and the Ypres League, so that people there will be at least one where the proper explanation is being given of why and how and when these things were put in place, probably pointing out where the others ought to be found.
Also, in addition to that, on the panel as well, it's an opportunity also to put a little bit of history on there in terms of Hellfire Corner as well, because that has been over the years one of the areas where I know a lot of people have been keen to place memorials, and for safety reasons or whatever, it's not been possible. So it would be nice if we can put a little bit of information on the history of Hellfire Corner there as well, which will also educate people to the importance of that site.
Because I think somebody was going to build a warhorse memorial at Hellfire Corner at one point. I remember seeing a kind of fundraising page for it. And I kind of think, as we've mentioned, the memorialization is a kind of a two-edged sword, really, in that there has to be a future as well as a present.
The most crazy thing, I was just near Hellfire Corner, but just slightly beyond the roundabout, on the way to Hooch. There was one day a Dutch lady who approached in Flanders Fields Museum saying that she knew, meaning she felt, that she knew the place where a particular soldier had been killed, who's now on the Meningate, and that she wanted to pay for a memorial to be erected there. And that was just her personal spiritual feeling, knowing that this soldier with whom she had a connection had died there. So, but I mean, regarding memorialization, it is indeed a problem. And it's something that has always puzzled me, is the fact, how far would you go? I mean, a particular action, a particular regiment, a particular group, but how far do you go in commemorating individuals, for instance? I dread of seeing our First World War battlefields becoming something like Gettysburg. If you go to Gettysburg, you've got 1,000 memorials on a 4 square mile area. So it's absolutely crazy. Nobody ever. And it's as we already said, it's quite easy to have a memorial or a panel erected, but the maintenance is nobody ever thinks about the maintenance. And these demarcation stones, they're quite sturdy, they're still there, but there's quite a number of memorials, especially plaques, who have disappeared over the years, and some have been documented, but others haven't. And it's something that, for instance, the town administration of Ypres is quite worried about. Yeah, I mean, maybe we're partly to blame partly to blame. Over the last 20, 25 years, we've tried to integrate less commemorated groups, but of course they also want to be represented on the memorial landscape, which is not something you can. I mean, I'll just give you the example. The first memorial erected commemorating the Indian presence was one by the city of Ypres and the Sikh community in Hollebeke, on the spot where Indians got in action for the first time on the Western Front. That was followed by an official Indian memorial on the lawn south of the Menin Gate, so from the Indian government. But then the town was approached by the Nepalese embassy, because the Gurkhas were Nepalese nationals. Their first proposal was a large pink Buddha, where the town, so Ypres said, well, maybe a pink Buddha is not really very appropriate for a battlefield monument. And that's why now you have that little statue of a Gurkha a little bit further on. But then some time ago, but nothing came of it, the embassy of Pakistan also approached the town, said, well, we also want our memorial. And as you can hear, embassy here, embassy there, there's also always something political involved as well. The Indian memorial at the Menin Gate is by the Republic of India, which came into being in 1947. But the Indian soldiers who died in the First World War, they were all called Indian, but who today, for 1/3 or maybe even more, be hailing from Pakistan. So commemoration is much more complicated than most people think. And there's always, even the most official, or certainly the most official ways of commemorating, there's always a political aspect, which is why I'm also so supportive of an organization as the New Ypres League, because that is an organization of individuals. We're not standing, our main goal is commemorating, but with no hidden agenda. There's no, we do not have a purpose of commemorating these or that one, or highlighting just to give another example, if Ulster Orangemen are coming, of course they are commemorating their folk. We do not have something, the New Ypres League does not have something like our folk. They're all our folk. So that, I think that's also an important aspect, to be a neutral organization whose focus is entirely on commemorating for the sake of commemoration and for the sake of what happened during and immediately after the First World War.
And of course, that openness, or however you want to call it, extends, of course, to the German side as well, because the Ypres League already has close contact with the German War Grave Commission, and we've been invited and we've attended recent burials at Langemark German Cemetery. So, the organisation truly is encompassing, all sides who fought and obviously, unfortunately, fell, in the Ypres Salient during the First World War. But just getting back to the monuments as well, and the discussion about old and new monuments. When you start looking at, and this is why this project for me is so important, these original monuments, these are the fabric, this is the infrastructure of the Ypres Salient. And the people who placed those monuments, these were people who fought here, or they fought for those regiments or for those divisions. Now, when you start looking at the major monuments in the area erected by countries after the war, the Brooding Soldier, for example, of course, the Meningay, and so it goes on, of course, they're all looked after, by their governments and paid for by their governments. But these smaller monuments, these divisional memorials, like the one over at Hill 60, for example, and the Demarcation Stones, the Light Division, it's the 20th Division over at Langemark, who's responsible for those? And so it's important that people start looking towards, preservation of these individual monuments. Not necessarily the most fashionable ones or the most visited ones, but it's important because the idea behind them is these are erected by people who were here at the time.
The thing is, because that's maybe interesting for the broader public, and very few people know that, is there are two lists in Ypres circulating, and one list is the non-CWGC memorials maintained by the War Graves Commission, which maintenance it's usually passive maintenance, so it's taking away everything, green and moist and so on. And there's a second list of other, well, let's call them orphaned memorials, which is almost as large, and that's the Ypres Park Services, who make sure that it is the bins are cleared and moist, so that small reparations are done, and that the area looks fine. So it is, in a certain respect, already a common endeavor, but in each case, whether it's the Ypres Park Service or the War Graves Commission, when it concerns the so-called orphaned memorials, it's passive preservation. So it's not really active restoration.
So in terms of what you're proposing to do with the demarcation stones that remain today, you're going to become the kind of custodians of that, but obviously you're going to need to raise money to help with renovations and the information panel and everything else. So kind of tell us a bit more about that and how people can get involved and support that.
So first of all, we've identified from records, of course, the demarcation stones that the original Ypres League were responsible for. And we plan to do them, not all at once, of course, but start to do them in order, with the Hellfire Corner one being probably the most important one to do first, because of its condition and because of its historical significance and siting as well. So we've approached the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and they've been incredibly helpful, offering us the skills of their stonemasons. So the War Graves Commission will be doing the work. They'll be taking the stone away to Bahrain and then doing the work on the stone. And of course, we've had to launch an appeal really for funds. The demarcation stone alone, or at Hellfire Corner, alone, depending upon what work needs doing, could be anything, 6,000, 8,000 euros, depending upon also the money we get back from Flemish Heritage, because Flemish Heritage have very generously agreed that they will rebate some of the money, some of the costs back as well. But when you think we've got 7 to do, it's quite a large amount of money to raise. Now, we've already had 2 incredibly generous donations, which has set us well on our way. James Stewart Smith, our patron, who I mentioned earlier, held 3 shooting days last year in the UK, and the money raised for that, or those 3 days, has gone towards the Demarcation Stone project. And one of our members, Michelle Admiral, has made a huge donation as well, which again goes a long way to having the work done. But I kind of estimate, I don't know what Dominic thinks, but I kind of estimate we're going to need around about another 8,000 euros, I would think, depending upon what Flemish Heritage do to get all of these demarcation stones back to some sort of order. And on top of that, that does not include what we decide to do and what we can get permission to do with the missing stone over at Wiltshire, the one which disappeared during the Second World War. but our immediate priority is to get the existing ones back up to speed. So really, we're looking for donations. Every penny, every euro, every dollar given to us is important and will be used purely for the Demarcation Stone project. And of course, we will keep everybody in, hopefully through this medium as well, Paul, updates on how we are going with this.
And I guess in the first instance, people could join the Ypres League to kind of get things moving. And then we'll put links to that and also to your fundraising page as well, where they can make direct donations towards this.
Yeah, the Ypres League website has got a donation section on it purely for the Demarcation Stones. And yes, with regards to membership, of course, everybody is welcome, and we would welcome new members absolutely with open arms. It's a great community that we have now within the Ypres League. It's a very social community. People all who have got the same kind of aims and interests in terms of the Ypres Salient. We hold events throughout the year. We're relaunched, or we have rebooted, in effect, the Ypres Day on October the 31st, which was, the old Ypres League's day of commemoration here. So there's lots of events going on through the year for members as well. So yes, please, if anyone would like to consider joining, please do so.
And the new Ypres League is what we call in Belgium a VZW, which means a non-profit, a registered non-profit organization, so something like a registered charity in the UK.
So we'll put links to both of those things onto the show notes and the podcast website from this. And what kind of time frame do you see going forward? Obviously, it's going to take a while to raise the money you want, and then start with Hellfire Corner. So I guess this is going to progress over the course of the next few years, really.
Yeah, but I think, and I mean, Roger, I know that you will usually contradict me if I'm wrong, so go ahead. But I'm pretty sure that the Hellfire Corner one is something that should be done in 2026. So
yeah, absolutely.
I mean, imagine that Ypres Day 2026, we could focus on the Hellfire Corner Demarcation Stone. That would be great.
Yeah, I mean, that would be great. Yeah, because I guess you could also drum up quite a lot of kind of press interest in something like that, and then take it to beyond mere podcasts like this to a much bigger audience who perhaps don't even know or aren't even aware that these things even exist.
Yeah, well, that's one of the aims. And I mean, quite frankly, locally, there is an interest from the handful of journalists we still have in Ypres, so they're aware of our existence. And so now and then, I think Roger has the same experience. They would ask, okay, what are the plans at this moment? So I think locally we're getting more and more known. So it's not only within the group of First World War buffs, but also locally and those with an interest in local history.
I think also this is why this project is very important, because the new Ypres League is not just purely a remembrance organisation. Remembrance, of course, is important, and it'll always be one of the cores of the organisation. But as an organisation, it's also great for people to see that we're actually making a physical difference to things here in the Salient. We're not taking out, we're putting back in. So for an organisation's point of view, and I know it's important also, for a lot of our members, that we're seen to be actively engaging, in the area.
Yeah, I mean, we just did a podcast about, entitled "Are We Forgetting the First World War?" Well, on one level, of course, we're not, but there is a kind of danger of drift 10 years after the centenaries, with the kind of public attention moving to, let's say, World War II, for example, and that the First World War begins to seem too far into the past. But it's been very interesting to kind of read people's reaction to this, in that they argue that actually it's becoming perhaps more and more important. And I have a lot of under 35s listen to the podcast, and I had an email from a 20-year-old today saying how his generation are never going to forget, that they're just as fascinated by it. And this is all good signs. So you're kind of, I think what's really important about what you're doing is you're building on the legacy of the past to create a legacy for the future, for this next generation of people who will take this forward.
If we get back to the beginning of this, the importance of the demarcation stones as boundary stones of marking the high water mark of the tide of invasion, well, that's quite relevant for our days. Maybe the Ukraine one day will erect something like the demarcation stones. But then the first ones who were ever erected were those along the Western Front of the First World War.
It's interesting because I mean the only other place I know where there are demarcation stones is in the Belgian Ardennes for the Battle of the Bulge,
Yeah.
where a kind of similar kind of language. And it was interesting what you were saying about the difference between the word for invader in Flemish compared to British, and I think that language of how that generation spoke about the enemy, which you often see depicted on memorials, is a fascinating subject in its own right.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of the reasons why, I mean, I sometimes have to explain as a historian that the Germany of then is not the Germany of the Second World War, and is certainly not the Germany of today. I've given the example of India and Pakistan, and the world has changed so much since. Mentality of the people has changed. So it's not getting easier to explain what happened then and why it happened and how it happened, but still the lessons to be learned for today, whatever your interpretation and your view on military and why the war was fought and so on, but the lessons for today are huge. And again, just look at what happened and how things are happening in the Ukraine, and the similarities, despite the differences, but the similarities with the First World War are tremendous, tremendous.
I think you're right, Dominic, because if you don't remember, you're doomed to repeat the same mistakes again.
Yeah, well, I mean, we should not get too philosophical. I have my thoughts on that regarding humankind and repeating mistakes from the past. But it's not because we're doing it again and again that we should not try to. I mean, at least it's the duty of those who are in the known to defuse these ideas, I would say.
I kind of prefer the words of General Arthur Currie, who commanded the Canadian Corps, and he said something along the lines of when he was asked, I mean, he only lived a couple of decades after the Great War, but he was asked, why should Canada still remember? And he said something along the lines of, well, if these are the things that we forget, what is it that we should remember? And I guess what he's saying there is, what is important to Canada as a nation, to all of these nations that participated in the Great War, including Germany, of course, because that's just as much a part of the story as those who are on the western side of the Western Front. So it's I think it's all part of what I guess makes the First World War still relevant.
Yeah, and that's on a multi level, on a maximal level, but on a macro level, but on the micro level, as something else that you just raised, Paul. What I think that was extremely important during the centenary was not the official commemorations. It was how you saw that in all the nations involved, there was an interest from family historians and family members. And the number of casualties and the numbers of those involved in the First World War are so enormous that it is just impossible that it will disappear, because you will always have people who are interested in genealogy or in their family history, and at one point they will encounter the First World War, whether it is like in the case of Belgium as a refugee, or as a soldier or a prisoner of war, or whatever. So the interest might change in character, but will never fade away. It will never go away.
And it always feels like it's an evolving subject, as you both know so well, that the part of that is the landscape, isn't it? The way that the landscape keeps talking to us. That last, as you coined that phrase in Flanders, that last witness of the First World War, that every time it's peeled back, it's got a new story to tell, whether that's the discovery of human remains or the unearthing of a trench system or a bunker or whatever it is. So we're far from ever knowing it all.
Absolutely, yeah. And sometimes I got the question, oh yeah, well, still working on that First World War. Don't we know everything by now? And then I start summing up all the things we do not know, and well, people get bored after 15 minutes.
I have the same actually on battlefield tours. I get asked a lot, do you get bored doing the same sites or whatever? And no, because every tour is different. The people on the tours, the stories on the tours, relative stories, every tour is different.
Yeah, but even the military side, it's only, I mean, infantry and cavalry, that's okay, but then artillery, what do we know about the artillery units? Hardly anything. Logistics, transport, so much that, and
It's
that's
a
only the
huge
military.
subject.
That's only the
Yeah.
military aspect. So there is still for the generations, not only our generations, but those the 35-year-olds listening to your podcast, Paul. I mean, if they're in search of a subject, send them on.
Well, I think the Ypres League has plenty of work to keep it busy over the course of the coming years.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add actually on the subject, of younger people. One of the aims of the new Ypres League is to encourage younger members as well, and the younger people to get involved in this. On Ypres Day last year, 2025, we had a scout band from the UK, parade of us, a brass band playing all the way up to the Menin Gate, and it was fantastic. It was great to see young people having a genuine interest and wanting to be involved, and it's important. This is encouraged. These are the people of the future.
So I think this is a fascinating project, an incredible one to preserve something that is so important to that landscape of the First World War. We'll put the details of how people can get involved. I'm sure we'll come back to you guys to kind of get an update, and I'll try and if it does happen this Ypres Day in 2026 that you can get Hellfire Corner sorted out, I'll come out and maybe we can actually record something on site at the time to broadcast down the line to look at the next phase of what you're going to do.
Yeah, put it in your diary, Paul. Can I just add, just quickly, just to say to people, I know things are tough at the minute, but please, if you can spare anything, please help us, achieve our aims with this project. And as we've mentioned, you can donate very easily on the new Ypres League website.
That's brilliant. Thanks to you both. We could sit here and talk all night about the Great War and Flanders Fields, I know, but that's a bit more for another day, I think. But thank you both for joining me tonight, and thanks for this important work that you're both doing out there and everyone else involved in the Ypres League.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Somcor. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.